Two racist police officers stopped the car of a black woman and arrested her unjustly out of pure prejudice, but they had chosen the wrong woman to mess with, not knowing she was a powerful judge, and what she did to them would shock the entire country. It was supposed to be just another night, another routine traffic stop on a deserted highway, another anonymous target they thought no one would care about. They thought they were doing what they always did, flexing their power against those they saw as weak, as outsiders, as people who, in their eyes, did not belong. They didn't know that by pulling her over, they were about to ignite a storm they would not survive. They had no idea that by shackling her wrists, they were setting the stage for their own public downfall. The cold air stung the woman's face as the flashing lights drenched the lonely stretch of highway in harsh red and blue pulses. She pulled over without protest, her hands clearly on the steering wheel, every movement slow, every breath measured. She knew better than to make a wrong move. But knowing the rules doesn't always save you when the rules are twisted against you. One officer approached aggressively, his hand already resting on the butt of his gun. His partner stayed behind, hand on the flashlight, scanning her license plate with suspicion, like she was a criminal by default. "What's a lady like you doing out here this late?" sneered the officer, his voice dripping with the kind of contempt that doesn't need to be hidden in the middle of nowhere. "I'm coming back from work," she answered evenly, her voice steady despite the tight coil of fear winding in her chest. "Work, huh? What are you, a waitress? A janitor?" The other officer laughed under his breath, not even trying to hide his disdain. She didn't answer. She knew the trap. Silence was often safer. But silence, too, can be used against you. "Step out of the vehicle," ordered the first officer, his tone already implying that any hesitation would be seen as resistance. She complied. Slowly. Carefully. Respectfully. And yet, before she could even close her car door, they grabbed her arms, twisting them behind her back with unnecessary force, snapping cold steel cuffs onto her wrists. Her heart pounded not from guilt, but from the raw rage and humiliation burning in her veins. "People like you shouldn't be driving cars like this. Must be stolen," one officer muttered, pushing her toward their squad car. She wanted to scream, but she knew better. She wanted to cry, but she refused to give them the satisfaction. They shoved her into the back seat like she was nothing, like she was invisible, like she didn't have a name, a story, a life that mattered. As the squad car sped down the empty highway, the officers joked and laughed as if what they had done was just another night's entertainment. They spoke about her as if she wasn't even there. They called her one of those, said she was probably looking for trouble, said it was better to get her off the streets before she caused real damage. But the real damage had already been done, to them. They just didn't know it yet. Inside that car, she wasn't just a victim. She was a storm gathering strength. Every insult, every shove, every cruel word was another layer to the hurricane she was about to unleash. They thought they were taking her freedom. They were, in fact, handing her the very weapons she would later use to destroy their careers, their reputations, and their illusions of untouchable power. At the station, the humiliation continued. They paraded her through the halls, parading her like a trophy, bragging about how they caught a suspicious one before anything bad could happen. Paperwork was filled with lies. Reports were filed with fabrications. Charges were imagined out of thin air. No one questioned them. No one stopped them. Racism dressed in uniform moved like a machine, efficient and remorseless. And still, she stayed silent. Watching. Listening. Waiting. There was no badge number exchange. No Miranda rights properly read. No presumption of innocence. Just the crushing certainty that her skin color had made her guilty before she ever opened her mouth. It was a scene that had played out countless times before, against countless others who had no voice, no platform, no power to fight back. But this time, they had made a mistake they couldn't undo. The woman they thought was powerless was actually one of the most powerful figures in the state. A judge. A fierce advocate for justice. A woman whose influence reached deeper into the halls of government and the corridors of law than they could ever comprehend. And when the moment came, when the mask would come off and the truth would be revealed, they would find themselves not behind the badge, but in front of it, stripped bare before a court of law, answering for every second of brutality, every ounce of prejudice they had poured into that night. And she would be the one holding the gavel. But it wasn't just about personal revenge. It wasn't just about making them pay. It was about sending a message so loud, so undeniable, that the entire system would have to listen. It was about dragging the rotten roots of injustice into the burning light for everyone to see. It was about turning her own humiliation into a weapon of change. And as news spread of what had happened, as media outlets picked up the story, as social media exploded with outrage, as people across the country learned her name and what she stood for, the question hanging over everyone's head wasn't just what would happen to those two officers. The real question, the one burning in the hearts of every viewer, every listener, every witness to this injustice, was simple yet devastating: how far would she go to make sure they never did this to anyone else again? Before we start today's story, we want to send a message of support to every Black viewer watching. Here at Plow of Twist, we firmly stand against all forms of racism, discrimination, and injustice. We believe in respect, equality, and the power of real stories to create change. Stay strong, stay proud. Now, get ready for an unforgettable story, and don't forget to subscribe to Plow of Twist to keep supporting powerful narratives like this one. Enjoy the story. Alicia Carter was a woman who carried herself with quiet dignity, a woman who had learned from an early age that respect was not given freely to people who looked like her, it had to be earned, demanded, defended. Growing up in the heart of Atlanta, Georgia, Alicia saw firsthand the silent, grinding realities of racial prejudice, not the blatant, headline-grabbing atrocities, but the subtle, daily erosions of opportunity, dignity, and hope. Her parents, working-class heroes in their own right, taught her that education was the shield and sword she needed to fight back, to carve out her space in a world that too often tried to erase women like her. Alicia didn't just excel, she outworked, outthought, and outlasted, moving through school with a fierce determination that only sharpened with each sideways glance, each whispered slight, each door closed in her face. By the time she graduated law school at the top of her class, she wasn't just ready for the world, she was ready to change it. Her rise through the legal ranks wasn't meteoric, it was methodical. Every case she took, every client she defended, every injustice she exposed became another stone in the fortress she was building around herself, a fortress made not of arrogance but of armor. When she was appointed as a judge, many had murmured that it was about time someone like her sat on that bench, but few truly understood the cost she had paid to get there, the lonely nights, the endless battles, the burden of having to be twice as good just to be seen as equal. In the courtroom, Alicia was a force of nature, calm, commanding, and utterly unimpressed by status or bluster. She had an almost preternatural ability to see through lies, to cut through excuses, to reach the heart of a matter with precision and fairness. But outside the robes and gavels, she was just Alicia, a woman who loved her community, who mentored young law students, who visited her parents every Sunday for fried chicken and sweet tea, who sang off-key in her car when she thought no one was listening. On the night everything changed, Alicia was driving home from an unusually long day at the courthouse. She had presided over a particularly grueling case involving police misconduct, a case that had left her drained and reflective. The city lights faded behind her as she took the longer, quieter route home, preferring the peace of the open road to the cluttered tension of the urban sprawl. Her silver sedan glided smoothly over the blacktop, the steady hum of the tires a soothing counterpoint to the chaos of her thoughts. The stars were scattered like spilled salt across the ink-black sky, and for a brief, precious moment, Alicia allowed herself to breathe, to feel a rare sense of calm. But peace, for women like Alicia, was always a fragile thing. The first flash of blue and red in her rearview mirror was not immediately alarming. Traffic stops were common enough. Maybe a taillight was out, maybe a routine check. She pulled over to the shoulder of the deserted highway, hands already on the steering wheel, window rolled down, posture open and non-threatening. She knew the drill better than most. Still, a tiny, familiar knot of anxiety twisted in her stomach, a primal warning passed down through generations: be polite. Be non-threatening. Be invisible. The two officers who approached her car didn't see Alicia Carter, respected judge and pillar of the community. They didn't see the years of study, the nights spent burning through case law, the victories and heartbreaks of a lifetime of fighting for justice. They saw only a black woman, alone, in a nice car, on a dark road. Their steps were aggressive, heavy with unspoken assumptions. One of them, Officer Reed, tapped his flashlight against her window hard enough to make her flinch, even though the glass was already down. His partner, Officer Miller, stayed back slightly, hand resting casually but unmistakably on the grip of his holstered gun. License and registration, Reed barked, not bothering with pleasantries, not offering even the pretense of courtesy. Alicia kept her voice calm, her movements slow. Of course, officer. It's in my glove compartment. May I reach for it? Reed scoffed, an ugly sound. Don't get smart. Just move. She retrieved the documents, handing them over with steady hands, but Reed barely glanced at them before tossing them onto the hood of her car as if they were trash. Miller circled the vehicle like a vulture, shining his light into the back seat, muttering under his breath about suspicious behavior. You been drinking tonight? Reed asked suddenly, his tone accusatory rather than inquisitive. No, sir, Alicia replied evenly. You out here buying something? Selling something? His words were sharp, slicing through the night air with deliberate cruelty. No, sir. I'm heading home from work. Reed leaned in closer, his face inches from hers, his breath sour with the smell of stale coffee. Work, huh? What kind of work puts you on this road this late? Stripping? Dealing? You don't look like no office worker to me. The humiliation was sharp, a blade pressed against her pride. Alicia swallowed the anger rising in her throat. She had to stay calm. She had to survive this. Before she could respond, Miller was at her door, yanking it open without warning. Step out of the vehicle. Now. The command left no room for argument. Alicia complied, stepping onto the cool asphalt, her heart hammering against her ribs. Reed roughly turned her around, twisting her arms behind her back with unnecessary force. The metallic snap of the handcuffs was deafening in the quiet night. You're under arrest for resisting a lawful order, he said, the words mechanical, empty of meaning or truth. She wasn't resisting. She wasn't even questioning. But it didn't matter. Her compliance was irrelevant. Her innocence was irrelevant. Her dignity was disposable. They shoved her into the back seat of their cruiser, the hard plastic of the seat biting into her wrists and back. As they drove, they spoke about her as if she weren't there, trading jokes and slurs, weaving a narrative that painted her as dangerous, deceitful, deserving of everything they were doing to her. The station was a fluorescent-lit nightmare. They processed her slowly, deliberately, forcing her to stand for mugshots, to strip off her jewelry, to empty her pockets. Each step was another slash against her humanity. She could see it in the smirks of the desk officers, in the averted eyes of the few who knew this wasn't right but said nothing. She could feel it in the casual cruelty of the paperwork that misrepresented her every word and action. Hours passed in a suffocating haze. She sat alone in a holding cell, the metal bench cold against her skin, the air heavy with the stench of despair. Alicia replayed every moment, searching for a mistake she hadn't made, a law she hadn't broken, a way she could have changed the outcome. But deep down, she knew the truth. This wasn't about her actions. It was about her existence. Somewhere in the bowels of that station, Reed and Miller laughed about their latest catch. Somewhere in the city, her parents slept, unaware that their daughter, the judge, the symbol of everything they had fought to build, sat in a jail cell for the crime of daring to exist in the wrong place at the wrong time. But Alicia wasn't broken. She wasn't defeated. She was waiting. Watching. Planning. Because unlike the countless victims who had come before her, she held a weapon far more powerful than fear or rage. She held the law itself. She knew the system inside and out, knew its cracks and its weaknesses, knew exactly how to turn its weight against those who misused it. And when the moment came, when the world learned who they had dragged out of that car and thrown into a cell, there would be consequences. Real consequences. Consequences that would shatter the lives of the men who had thought they could humiliate her without ever facing justice. But that night, in that cold, silent cell, Alicia Carter made a vow to herself. Not just to survive. Not just to seek revenge. But to transform her pain into power, her humiliation into history. Because sometimes, the most dangerous thing you can do to a system built on oppression is simply survive it, and then hold it accountable. The hours passed slowly in the holding cell, each tick of the dirty clock on the wall echoing in Alicia's bones like a drumbeat of injustice. Her mind wasn't idle, it was alive, racing, calculating. She was thinking of procedures, of rights violated, of reports she knew they had to file, of the many ways their careless brutality would come back to haunt them. She didn't need anger to sustain her, knowledge was enough. Knowledge was power, and she wielded it with deadly precision, even now, even cuffed and discarded. Across the hall, the officers responsible lounged comfortably at their desks, laughing, bragging, their arrogance so loud it seemed to fill every crevice of the station. They hadn't even bothered to check her name properly. They thought they were untouchable, invincible, just another night, just another black woman swallowed by the system without a sound. The metal bars clanged loudly as the night shift sergeant made his rounds, his heavy boots thudding against the floor. When he stopped at her cell and looked at her through the bars, Alicia raised her head slowly, letting her eyes meet his. For a moment, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his gaze, a half-formed question he didn't ask. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The truth was already whispering through the air, subtle but inevitable. She was not who they thought she was. And the longer they left her there, the deeper their mistake would carve itself into their lives. "Hey, lady," called Reed from across the room, his voice loud and mocking. "Hope you're comfortable. You might be staying a while." Miller laughed, kicking back in his chair. "She probably thinks she's gonna call some boyfriend to bail her out." "Sweetheart, nobody's coming." Alicia didn't answer. She didn't flinch. She sat perfectly still, a portrait of patience and quiet fury. They mistook her silence for defeat, and that miscalculation would cost them more than they could ever imagine. As the early morning hours approached, a junior officer, a young man named Officer Jenkins, was tasked with checking the paperwork. He was new, fresh out of the academy, still green enough to believe that rules mattered. He flipped through the documents with increasing confusion, his brow furrowing deeper with each page. Something wasn't right. There were gaps, inconsistencies, procedures skipped entirely. And when he finally read the name on the intake form, his blood ran cold. He stood frozen for a long moment before slowly lifting his gaze toward the cell where Alicia sat. "Sergeant," Jenkins called out, his voice strained, trying to sound casual and failing. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" The sergeant grunted, annoyed, but followed him into a quieter corner of the station. Voices were low, tense. Reed and Miller barely noticed, too busy swapping stories about past stops, past humiliations they had proudly inflicted. Jenkins returned alone, his face pale, avoiding Alicia's gaze. The sergeant didn't come back right away. He was on the phone now, in the supervisor's office, speaking in hushed, frantic tones. And as the minutes ticked by, a slow, creeping unease began to settle over the station like a heavy fog. Alicia watched it all unfold with the cold detachment of a seasoned strategist. She knew the exact moment when fear began to bloom in the hearts of the officers. It was like watching a crack appear in a wall, small at first, but spreading fast, unstoppable. Reed glanced over at her cell once, then again, his smug confidence faltering. Miller shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Whispers traveled fast in places like this, and already the other officers were pulling out their phones, searching her name, confirming the catastrophic mistake that had been made. When the sergeant finally emerged from the office, his face was set in a mask of forced calm. He approached her cell with keys in hand, but he didn't meet her eyes. His voice was low, almost deferential, when he spoke. "Ma'am," he said, unlocking the door, we're going to release you now." Alicia rose slowly, every movement deliberate. She stepped out of the cell, her spine straight, her head high. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The silence screamed louder than any words could. As she was escorted, not pushed, not dragged, to retrieve her personal belongings, the station had fallen into a thick, choking silence. Reed stood rigid, his face pale and sweating, while Miller stared at the floor like it might open up and swallow him whole. Alicia gathered her things with steady hands. Her phone, her earrings, her wallet. She checked each item carefully, methodically, letting the tension stretch unbearably tight. When she finally turned to face the two officers, her voice was calm, almost gentle, but every syllable carried the weight of the storm about to be unleashed. "You have no idea," she said, "what you've done." Neither man answered. What could they say? Apologies would be meaningless. Excuses would be pathetic. Silence was their only refuge now, and even it offered no protection. Outside the station, the dawn was breaking over the horizon, casting the city in a pale, unforgiving light. Alicia didn't rush to leave. She stood on the steps, breathing in the cool morning air, feeling the promise of justice swelling inside her like a tide. Her mind was already at work, crafting the next steps with the same precision she used to dismantle weak arguments in her courtroom. It wouldn't be enough to press charges. It wouldn't be enough to file a complaint. No, this demanded something larger. Something that would leave a mark they would never be able to erase. She made one phone call. 1. By noon, the first calls started coming into the station. By 2 o'clock, local reporters were stationed across the street, cameras rolling, microphones ready. By evening, the mayor's office had released a terse, panicked statement promising a full investigation. The chief of police cancelled all public appearances and disappeared into closed-door meetings. Reed and Miller weren't laughing anymore. They were suspended pending investigation, but everyone in the station knew what was coming. The evidence was overwhelming. The body camera footage, yes, even without her speaking a word, told the story better than any witness ever could. The disrespect. The illegal search. The wrongful arrest. It was all there, undeniable, damning. Still, Alicia stayed silent publicly. She refused interviews. She refused statements. She let the public's outrage build on its own, let the truth sink in deep without the distraction of her voice. She had something far more devastating planned than a simple press conference. Because the real reckoning wasn't happening in front of news cameras. It was happening behind closed doors, in a courthouse where Alicia Carter's name carried the weight of justice itself. And when the day came for Reed and Miller to answer for what they had done, when they stood trembling in courtrooms they once treated like their personal playgrounds, they would find themselves facing not just the consequences of their actions, but the full, unstoppable force of the very system they had once twisted and weaponized against others. They thought they had taken her dignity that night. They had, instead, given her the perfect weapon. And what she was about to do with it would leave the entire city, and the entire country, utterly speechless. The courthouse loomed large under the gray afternoon sky, an imposing structure of stone and glass that had seen decades of battles fought and lives changed within its walls. Today, it was different. Today, the walls themselves seemed to pulse with anticipation, with the weight of something extraordinary about to unfold. Reporters clustered on the steps, cameras flashing, microphones thrust into faces desperate for a quote, a glimpse, a soundbite. Inside, the air was thick with tension so real it seemed to buzz against the skin. Officers in full dress uniform lined the corridors, not out of respect but out of necessity. The city's most powerful eyes were watching. The nation's attention had turned here, to this place, to this moment. In the small, wood-paneled courtroom, every seat was filled. Lawyers in crisp suits murmured to one another, glancing nervously toward the heavy oak doors. Reed and Miller sat at the defense table, their uniforms replaced by plain suits that somehow made them look even smaller, even more exposed. Their faces were drawn tight with anxiety, hands clenching and unclenching in their laps. They had been through weeks of hearings, through humiliating interrogations, through the brutal stripping away of every lie they had ever wrapped themselves in. And now, it had all led here. When the doors finally opened, the room shifted, a collective holding of breath. Alicia Carter entered, her robe flowing behind her like a banner of war. Her presence commanded immediate silence, her expression unreadable but her eyes sharp, alive with a quiet fire that needed no announcement. She moved with slow, deliberate steps toward the judge's bench, every movement measured, every second dragging the tension higher. She didn't look at Reed or Miller as she passed them. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was a condemnation more powerful than any words. The clerk called the court to order, and Alicia took her seat. The murmur of the crowd died into a silence so profound that the shuffle of papers and the creak of leather chairs seemed deafening. She adjusted her glasses, reviewed the files in front of her with deliberate calm, then finally raised her eyes to the two men before her. "Officers Reed and Miller," she began, her voice steady, low, every syllable weighted with authority, "today you stand accused not just of professional misconduct, but of violating the very principles you swore to uphold. The court has reviewed the evidence extensively. Body cam footage. Station logs. Eyewitness testimonies. The facts are not in dispute." Reed swallowed visibly, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. Miller shifted uncomfortably, glancing sideways at his lawyer, who offered nothing but a shallow nod. Alicia leaned forward slightly, her gaze pinning them in place. "You treated an innocent citizen with cruelty and contempt. You abused your power. You betrayed the public trust. And all of it, because of a bias so deep, so automatic, that you didn't even bother to question it." The room was frozen, locked in the gravity of her words. Alicia paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of their crimes settle like stones around their necks. "Stand," she commanded. The two men rose awkwardly, their shoulders hunched, their faces pale. Alicia kept her eyes on them, cold and unwavering. "Look at me," she said. Slowly, fearfully, they did. "You thought you were above the law," Alicia continued, her voice low, almost a whisper, but razor sharp. "You thought no one would care. That no one would believe a black woman over two officers in uniform. You thought wrong." Reed opened his mouth, a dry, desperate sound escaping, but Alicia cut him off with a simple, sharp gesture. "This court does not tolerate excuses," she said. "This court recognizes only responsibility." She reached for a sheet of paper on her bench, unfolding it slowly, methodically. "As of today, both of you are hereby stripped of your badges, your certifications, your pensions. You are barred from ever serving in any law enforcement capacity again." Miller's knees buckled slightly, his lawyer grabbing his arm to steady him. Reed stood rigid, his hands trembling visibly. "But that's not all," Alicia said, her voice gaining strength, rising like a tide. "You are ordered to publicly apologize not just to me, which, frankly, is irrelevant, but to every citizen you have ever sworn to protect and serve. You will perform 2,000 hours of community service in the communities you have harmed. And you will attend mandatory racial bias training under the direct supervision of the Civil Rights Board you have so blatantly disrespected." A gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by a smattering of murmurs. Alicia waited until silence reclaimed the room before delivering the final blow. "And you will do all of this," she said, her voice cold and implacable, "under the full scrutiny of a public oversight committee. Every step you take, every action you perform, every word you speak for the next 5 years, will be monitored." She let the sentence hang there, final and absolute. Then, and only then, she rose from her seat. The courtroom remained silent, everyone too stunned to move, to breathe. She turned her gaze fully onto Reed and Miller one last time, her voice dropping to a near whisper, but the impact of her words hitting with the force of a hammer. You tried to erase me. Instead, you have etched my name into your history, permanently. Reed's face crumpled, a mixture of rage, fear, and humiliation. Miller's mouth worked soundlessly, his eyes darting wildly around the room, looking for some escape that did not exist. Alicia gave them none. She simply stepped down from the bench, her steps slow, measured, deliberate. The entire room stood as she passed, a spontaneous, unspoken gesture of respect. Cameras clicked furiously. Reporters scrambled. Lawyers stared, wide-eyed and silent. Even the officers who had once scorned her now stood rigidly, some with the glimmer of reluctant admiration in their eyes. Outside, the world waited. Alicia paused at the doors, taking one last breath before pushing them open and stepping into the blinding glare of flashbulbs and shouted questions. She didn't flinch. She didn't slow. She moved through the chaos like a force of nature, unstoppable and undeniable. Reed and Miller, left behind in the courtroom, knew without a doubt that their lives had been irrevocably changed, not by violence, not by anger, but by the sheer, relentless power of truth and justice wielded by the very woman they had tried to silence. And yet, as Alicia disappeared into the crowd, one question remained, hanging heavy in the air, unanswered and echoing in every stunned heart: what would she do next? As Alicia descended the courthouse steps, the swarm of reporters erupted into a frenzy of shouted questions and flashing cameras, their voices blurring into a chaotic storm. She didn't slow her pace, didn't break her steady, composed stride, but inside, a storm was raging too, a hurricane of emotions that no calm exterior could fully contain. Relief warred with anger, satisfaction tangled with sorrow. She had achieved justice, but the cost, the emotional toll, was something no verdict could ever erase. She made her way toward the black sedan waiting at the curb, a car driven by her longtime colleague and friend, Marcus Lane, who had silently offered his support through the entire ordeal without demanding a word of explanation. As she slid into the passenger seat, Marcus glanced over at her, his expression heavy with questions he didn't voice. For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of everything that had happened hanging thickly between them. Then, in a voice low and rough with emotion, Marcus finally spoke, his words cutting through the thick air. "You didn't just win today," he said, gripping the steering wheel tightly, "you rewrote the damn rules." Alicia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She leaned her head back against the seat, closing her eyes briefly before answering. "I didn't do it for me," she said quietly. "I did it because if I didn't, they'd keep doing it to the next woman who looks like me. And the next. And the next." Marcus nodded, the muscle in his jaw twitching. "Still, what you did in there, that was something the whole damn world needed to see." They drove in silence for a while, the city passing by outside the window, the distant wail of sirens blending with the normal hum of life returning to its rhythm. But Alicia knew things would never quite return to normal, not for her, not for Reed and Miller, not for anyone who had witnessed what had transpired. The ripples of today's reckoning would spread outward, touching lives she would never meet, changing conversations in rooms she would never enter. Later that evening, Alicia sat alone in her living room, the lights dim, a single glass of water sweating onto the coaster beside her. Her phone buzzed with a stream of messages, colleagues, friends, strangers, words of support, admiration, gratitude. She read some, ignored others. Part of her wanted to disappear for a while, to slip into anonymity and just breathe without the heavy armor she had been forced to wear for so long. Her reverie was broken by a knock at the door. It was soft, hesitant. She hesitated for a moment, her instinct still sharp, before rising to answer it. When she opened the door, she found Officer Jenkins standing there, the young man from the station who had first realized who she was, the one who had pulled the first thread that unraveled everything. He looked painfully uncomfortable, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his posture awkward. "Judge Carter," he said, voice low, I'm sorry to bother you. Alicia studied him for a long moment before stepping aside wordlessly, allowing him in. He moved into the living room with the careful, uncertain steps of someone crossing a minefield, his eyes flicking around the room as if committing every detail to memory. Alicia didn't offer him a seat, didn't offer him a drink. She simply crossed her arms and waited. Jenkins began, then faltered, running a hand through his hair. I just needed to say. I'm sorry. For what happened? I didn't know. I didn't realize, and that's not an excuse. I should have seen it. I should have done something sooner. Alicia's voice, when it came, was soft but firm. You did something. You spoke up when it mattered. That's more than most. Jenkins shook his head, his face contorted with guilt. It wasn't enough. You shouldn't have had to go through that at all. For a long moment, Alicia said nothing, simply letting the silence stretch between them. Then she spoke, each word deliberate. It's not about me, she said. It's about what happens next. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to the next person. And the next. It's about building a system where someone like you doesn't have to be brave to do the right thing, because it's just the right thing. Jenkins' shoulders sagged under the weight of her words. He nodded slowly, absorbing them, letting them settle deep into his bones. I'll do better, he said, voice hoarse with emotion. I promise. Alicia nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion, then turned away, signaling that the conversation was over. Jenkins hesitated for a moment longer before quietly letting himself out, the door clicking shut behind him with a soft finality. The next morning, Alicia stood before a packed auditorium at the local university, the air buzzing with anticipation. She hadn't planned to speak publicly so soon, but when the invitation had come, she knew she couldn't say no. Too much was at stake. The future was being shaped now, in these fragile, volatile moments when anger and hope collided. She stood at the podium, the bright stage lights blinding, the expectant faces stretching out before her like a sea. She took a breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders, and then she spoke. I am not here today because I am special, she began, her voice carrying clearly across the room. I am here because I am a reflection of every person who has ever been judged by the color of their skin instead of the content of their character. I am here because silence is no longer an option. She told them about power, about how it's not just given, but taken, defended, reclaimed. She spoke about justice, not as an abstract ideal, but as a living, breathing necessity. She spoke about pain, the kind that doesn't just wound, but transforms, that burns away weakness and leaves only strength behind. And she told them about the two officers who thought they could erase her. I could have been broken, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I could have let anger consume me. But I chose something else. I chose to make them remember me, not as a victim, but as the judge of their fate. The crowd erupted into applause, a roar of approval that shook the room. Alicia stood there for a moment longer, absorbing it, letting it wash over her, not as validation but as fuel. When she stepped down from the stage, a young woman in the front row reached out, touching her hand briefly, reverently. Thank you, she whispered, tears in her eyes. For showing us what strength looks like. Alicia smiled, a small, fierce smile that carried the weight of everything she had endured and everything she had overcome. Outside, the world was still hard, still unfair, still full of battles waiting to be fought. But Alicia Carter was ready. And this time, she wasn't fighting alone. The days following the trial were a whirlwind of noise and quiet battles, of public adoration and private exhaustion. Alicia moved through it all like a ship through stormy waters, steady and unshaken on the surface but with unseen depths roiling beneath. Headlines screamed her name, news anchors debated her courage, commentators tried to dissect every gesture she had made inside that courtroom, every glance, every word. She became a symbol overnight, a rallying cry for justice in a country hungry for accountability. Yet behind the applause and the admiration, Alicia wrestled with a gnawing, inescapable question: had she truly achieved justice, or merely exacted revenge dressed up in righteousness? In her office, late at night, surrounded by towering stacks of legal briefs and case files, Alicia sat in silence, her robe draped over the back of her chair like a discarded mantle. The windows were open to the soft sounds of the city breathing below, a city that now saw her not just as a judge but as a revolutionary figure, an icon. She traced the rim of her coffee mug absent-mindedly, staring out into the darkness. The faces of Reed and Miller flashed through her mind, not the sneering, arrogant faces from the night on the highway, but the broken, hollow ones from the courtroom, stripped of their power, facing consequences they had never imagined would come for them. And for a moment, a sliver of doubt wormed its way into her heart. Was true justice supposed to feel so heavy? The thought gnawed at her, an unwelcome guest she couldn't ignore. Justice, she had always believed, was about restoration, about righting wrongs, not just punishing the guilty. And yet, she couldn't deny the grim satisfaction she had felt when she had stripped them of their authority, their status, their arrogance. She had watched their downfall not with detached judicial objectivity, but with a fire that burned far deeper and darker than she cared to admit. Had she crossed a line? Had she become, in some twisted way, a reflection of the very cruelty she fought against? Her phone buzzed sharply, dragging her from her spiraling thoughts. It was a message from Marcus, simple but loaded with meaning: meeting tomorrow. Civil Review Board. Big decision. She sighed, closing her eyes for a moment before responding. The fight wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. The next morning, the conference room was packed, the long mahogany table surrounded by faces that mirrored the spectrum of a city still struggling to heal its divisions. Activists, community leaders, legal experts, police representatives, and politicians sat stiffly, the air vibrating with unspoken tensions. Alicia sat at the head of the table, her posture composed, her gaze unreadable. She had been invited, some would say compelled, to help draft the new oversight measures that would govern police behavior in the wake of the scandal. It was an opportunity to create real, lasting change. It was also a battlefield riddled with landmines. The discussions were heated from the start. Some wanted sweeping reforms, immediate and aggressive, demanding mass firings, drastic budget cuts, full dismantling of certain departments. Others argued for more moderate changes, fearful of political backlash, citing the need to maintain order and public trust. Every voice was urgent, every opinion framed as a matter of survival. Alicia listened carefully, weighing each argument, feeling the enormous responsibility settling heavier and heavier on her shoulders. When it was her turn to speak, she rose slowly, surveying the room with the same piercing gaze that had frozen Reed and Miller in their tracks. "We have a rare chance," she began, her voice calm but carrying an undeniable authority, "to change the very foundation of how justice is delivered in this city. But we have to ask ourselves, are we here to rebuild or to destroy? Because anger, however justified, is a wildfire. It can burn down the broken house, yes. But if we don't plan for what comes after, all we'll have is ashes." The room grew still, the weight of her words sinking into every corner. "We cannot just punish," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "We must rebuild. We must redefine. We must create systems that do not require bravery to survive them. Systems where justice is not an act of defiance, but a fact of life." After the meeting, as people trickled out in tense, exhausted groups, Alicia remained behind, staring at the empty seats, feeling the loneliness of leadership settle into her bones. Marcus approached quietly, standing beside her without speaking for a long moment. "You're doing the right thing," he said eventually, his voice low. Alicia gave a bitter little smile. "Right doesn't always feel good." "No," he agreed. "But it matters." That evening, another visitor came to her door, but this time it was someone she hadn't expected to see, Reed's wife, a woman whose face was lined with stress, whose hands shook slightly as she clutched the strap of her worn handbag. Alicia let her in, more out of curiosity than compassion, and they sat across from each other in the small, neat living room, the distance between them filled with unsaid things. "I'm not here to excuse what he did," the woman said, her voice raw. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I know what he did was wrong. And I'm not blind to the hurt he caused. But I need you to know, he's not just that man you saw. He's a father. To our son. And now everything's gone." Alicia listened, her heart a complex knot of emotions. She thought of the boy, a child who would now grow up with the stain of his father's actions hanging over him, a child who would learn early that power can corrupt and that consequences are real. "I'm not asking for anything," the woman said again, her voice cracking. I just wanted you to see that it's not so simple. It's never simple." After she left, Alicia sat in the quiet, the woman's words echoing in her mind. It wasn't simple. Justice was never simple. It was messy and brutal and sometimes cruel in ways she hadn't anticipated. It demanded sacrifices she hadn't fully understood until she had to make them herself. As night fell, Alicia found herself back at the courthouse, walking the empty halls where so much of her life had been spent. She paused in front of the courtroom doors, tracing her fingers lightly over the worn wood. Inside, echoes of past battles lingered, the clash of arguments, the whispers of verdicts, the silent tears of the wronged and the redeemed. Tomorrow, she would have to make a choice. The city council would propose giving her expanded powers, unprecedented oversight, a chance to reshape the system almost single-handedly. It was tempting, the idea of fixing it all herself, of bending the system into something just, something better. But at what cost? Absolute power, even for good, was a dangerous thing. She had seen too many people lose themselves in it. Standing there, alone with her thoughts, Alicia faced the hardest question yet: could she lead the fight for justice without becoming another tyrant cloaked in righteousness? Could she wield power without being consumed by it? In the heavy silence of the courthouse, Alicia Carter understood that the battle was far from over. It was just beginning. And every step she took from now on would determine whether she remained a judge, or became the very thing she had fought against. The morning of the city council meeting dawned cold and gray, the kind of heavy sky that seemed to press down on the world, demanding seriousness, demanding thought. Alicia dressed carefully, choosing a simple, elegant navy suit, the color of deep water, of silent resolve. As she stood before her mirror fastening the small silver pin at her collar, a gift from her father when she graduated law school, she saw not just her reflection but the burden of the moment staring back at her. This was not about winning or losing anymore. This was about who she was becoming and what kind of future she was willing to shape with her own hands. The city was looking to her not just for justice but for leadership, for salvation, for something to believe in again. The council chambers were already packed when she arrived, every seat taken, people standing against the walls, spilling out into the hallway. Reporters hovered like vultures near the doors, their cameras poised, their notebooks ready. Alicia moved through the crowd with quiet authority, her presence opening a path before her without a single word spoken. As she entered the chamber, every head turned, conversations dying mid-sentence. She felt the weight of 1,000 hopes and fears settle onto her shoulders, but she carried it without flinching. The council members sat in a semicircle behind their long, polished table, papers spread before them, faces grim. The mayor, a stout woman with sharp eyes and a voice like gravel, called the meeting to order with a heavy gavel strike that echoed off the high ceilings. After a few procedural matters, the floor was given to Alicia. She rose from her seat slowly, deliberately, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor as she approached the podium. She looked out over the crowd, community activists, police officers, politicians, everyday citizens, and she knew, with a clarity that cut through all the noise, that this was not just about her anymore. It was about all of them. About what kind of city they would choose to be. "I stand before you today," she began, her voice steady, "not as a symbol, not as a hero, and certainly not as a savior. I stand here as a citizen. As someone who has seen what happens when the systems meant to protect us are twisted into weapons against us. She paused, letting her words settle, letting the silence draw them in. I was given an opportunity, she continued, her gaze sweeping the room. An opportunity to wield enormous power over the future of this city's law enforcement. An opportunity to enact change with a stroke of a pen. But power, unchecked, is a dangerous thing. Even when wielded with good intentions. Murmurs rippled through the room, a mixture of surprise and confusion. Alicia pressed on, her voice gaining strength. I do not believe that true change can be forced from above. It must be built from within. It must be owned by the people it affects. It must be more than fear of punishment, it must be a transformation of hearts, of minds, of culture. She stepped back from the podium slightly, her hands steady at her sides. I will not accept unilateral power. I will not become another figurehead who rules by fear instead of justice. Instead, I propose the creation of an independent civilian oversight board, composed of diverse members from our community, activists, lawyers, teachers, small business owners, everyday people who will work with, not against, law enforcement to rebuild trust. The room exploded into conversation, some in approval, others in skepticism. Alicia stood quietly, letting them react, absorbing the cacophony without flinching. She knew not everyone would agree. She didn't need everyone to agree. She needed them to believe, in the possibility of something better. After the meeting, as the crowd began to disperse in heated conversations and hurried exits, Marcus found her near the back of the room. His face was lit with a fierce pride she hadn't seen in him before. You didn't just take the easy way out, he said, clapping a hand on her shoulder. You showed them what real leadership looks like. Alicia smiled wearily, feeling the exhaustion seep into her bones now that the moment was past. I just hope it's enough, she said softly. It will be, Marcus replied. It already is. Later, back in her office, Alicia was gathering her things when a knock sounded at her door. She looked up to see Officer Jenkins standing there again, his expression uncertain, almost shy. She waved him in with a small gesture, too tired for formalities. He stepped inside, fidgeting with his hat in his hands, then blurted out in a rush, I want to be part of it. The Oversight Board. If you'll have me. Alicia blinked, surprised, then studied him carefully. There was no arrogance in him, no trace of the blind defensiveness she had seen in so many others. Just a young man desperate to be part of something better. Why? She asked, her voice low, genuinely curious. Jenkins swallowed hard, then said, because I saw what they did to you. And I didn't do enough. I can't change the past. But maybe I can help change what happens next. For a long moment, Alicia said nothing. Then she nodded once, slowly, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. All right, she said. You're in. The days that followed were a blur of planning meetings, legal consultations, community forums. Alicia threw herself into the work, building the board brick by careful brick, each decision made with painstaking attention to fairness, to transparency, to accountability. It was exhausting, thankless work, but it was the kind of work that mattered. At night, she often found herself standing at her window, looking out over the city lights, thinking about all the people she would never meet, whose lives might be just a little better because of what she had fought for. And sometimes, she thought of Reed and Miller, not with hatred, not even with anger, but with a kind of weary sorrow. They were not monsters. They were men who had lost their way, who had made choices that hurt others because they had been taught they could, because the system had never told them otherwise until now. One evening, as she was leaving the courthouse after another long day, Alicia spotted a familiar figure sitting on the steps. It was Miller, looking smaller, older, more broken than she remembered. He rose awkwardly as she approached, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket. I'm not here to cause trouble, he said quickly, his voice rough with nerves. I needed to say something. Alicia stopped a few steps away, crossing her arms, waiting. I was wrong, Miller said, staring at the ground. I was wrong about everything. About you. About people. About what it means to be a cop. He lifted his eyes, and in them, Alicia saw something she hadn't expected, not defiance, not self-pity, but genuine regret. I lost everything, he said. My badge. My friends. My family barely speaks to me. And I deserve it. But I needed you to know. I'm trying to be better. Alicia studied him for a long moment. Then, with a voice soft but unyielding, she said, being better isn't about what you say. It's about what you do when nobody's watching. Miller nodded, the words hitting him like blows he didn't try to dodge. He stepped back, giving her space, his posture heavy with the weight of his own failures. As he turned and walked away into the deepening twilight, Alicia felt a strange, complicated knot loosen slightly in her chest. Redemption was a long road. Some would walk it. Some would stumble. Some would never even try. But for the first time, she believed that maybe, just maybe, some good had come out of all the pain. She turned back toward the city, the courthouse behind her, the future stretching wide and uncertain before her. And Alicia Carter, judge, survivor, fighter, builder, walked forward into it without fear. The weeks turned into months, but the ripples of what had happened continued to expand outward, touching corners of the city Alicia had never even set foot in. Programs were initiated, training was revamped, and slowly, painfully slowly, conversations began to shift. It wasn't immediate, and it certainly wasn't perfect, but something fundamental had cracked open, something that would not easily be sealed shut again. Yet, with each small victory, each new policy signed into existence, Alicia felt the creeping tendrils of isolation tightening around her. Leadership had made her visible, but visibility had made her vulnerable. She had become a symbol of hope to many and a target of resentment to others. Every day, every decision, every word she spoke in public was weighed, twisted, judged. And there was no going back to anonymity, to safety. There was only forward. One evening, after a grueling meeting with the Civilian Oversight Board where arguments about the pace and depth of reforms had nearly torn the room apart, Alicia returned home to find Marcus waiting on her front porch. He sat on the steps, elbows on his knees, staring out at the street with a look that made her stomach tighten before he even opened his mouth. She dropped her bag inside the door and joined him, sitting beside him in the fading light, the cicadas humming loudly in the heavy summer air. "You ever wonder," he said after a long silence, "if we're actually making a difference? Or if we're just patching holes in a sinking ship?" Alicia didn't answer immediately. She watched a car glide down the street, its headlights cutting long shadows across the cracked sidewalk. Finally, she said, her voice low and steady, "I wonder every damn day." Marcus turned to look at her, his face lined with exhaustion and something deeper, something like doubt. "They don't want to change, Alicia." "Not really. Some of them do. A few. But most just want to survive the news cycle, wait until everyone forgets, then go back to business as usual." Alicia let out a breath, feeling the weight of that truth settle on her chest like a stone. "Maybe," she said. "But even if that's true, even if most people forget, some won't. Some will remember. Some will fight." Marcus shook his head, a bitter smile twisting his lips. "And what about you? How much longer can you fight? You're burning yourself out." She met his gaze squarely. "As long as it takes," she said simply. The porch light buzzed above them, drawing moths that battered themselves uselessly against the bulb. Marcus studied her for a long moment, then said, softer now, "Just don't lose yourself in it, Alicia. Promise me that." Alicia didn't promise. She couldn't. Some battles demanded more than a person should have to give, and she knew, deep in her bones, that this was one of them. Days later, she found herself called unexpectedly to a meeting with the mayor. It was held in a private room, away from the public eye, the windows thick with tinted glass, the walls insulated against eavesdropping. The mayor sat behind a massive desk, her fingers steepled under her chin, her eyes sharp and unreadable. "You've stirred up a lot of attention," the mayor said without preamble. "Some of it good. Some of it, complicated." Alicia remained standing, her back straight, refusing the unspoken invitation to sit. "I didn't come here to be liked," Alicia said evenly. "I came here to make sure what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else." The mayor leaned back in her chair, studying her. "Be careful, Alicia. Movements have a way of consuming their leaders. You start out fighting the system, but if you're not careful, you become part of it. Controlled by it. Owned by it." For a moment, the room seemed to shrink, the air tightening between them. "I don't work for the system," Alicia said quietly. "I work for the people." The mayor smiled thinly, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Good. Just remember which people." When Alicia left that meeting, the weight on her shoulders felt heavier than ever. Power, she realized, wasn't just about changing laws or punishing the guilty. It was about navigating the endless, shifting tides of influence, ambition, fear. It was about surviving not just the obvious attacks but the subtle ones, the compromises disguised as offers, the threats wrapped in compliments. A few nights later, she attended a town hall meeting hosted by the Civilian Oversight Board. It was packed, standing room only, the crowd a mixture of anger, hope, fear, and raw, desperate need. People lined up at the microphones, some shouting, some weeping, some speaking in the broken, halting language of those who had waited too long to be heard. One woman, middle-aged, her hair streaked with gray, spoke with a shaking voice about her son, about how he had been stopped, searched, humiliated for no reason other than the color of his skin. Her voice cracked, but she pressed on, forcing every word out like it was costing her pieces of herself. "All I want," she said, tears streaming down her face, "is for my boy to come home safe. That's it. That's all I want." Alicia sat silently, feeling the woman's pain hit her like a blow to the chest. When the woman finished, the room erupted into applause, not polite, not performative, but raw, ferocious support. Later, as Alicia was preparing to leave, the woman approached her, reaching out to touch her arm lightly. "Thank you," she said simply. Alicia placed her hand over the woman's, holding it for a long moment. "For him," Alicia said softly. "For all of them." In the weeks that followed, Alicia became more than just a judge. She became a mentor, a counselor, a target, a symbol. She met with school groups, held listening sessions in community centers, sat down with police cadets to tell them stories most of their instructors would never dare to share. She told them the truth, messy, painful, unvarnished. One night, after a particularly emotional session at a local high school, a teenager approached her in the parking lot. He was tall and thin, his backpack slung carelessly over one shoulder, his eyes wide and earnest. "Judge Carter," he said, his voice cracking slightly with nerves. "Can you really change it? All of this?" Alicia crouched slightly so she was eye level with him, seeing the desperate hope in his young face. "I can't change it alone," she said honestly. "But together? Maybe we can." The boy nodded, a small, fierce motion, then turned and disappeared into the night, his footsteps light, full of the kind of hope Alicia was terrified to betray. Driving home that night, Alicia realized something profound. The real fight wasn't just in courtrooms or city council meetings. It was in the hearts of people like that boy, like Jenkins, like the woman at the town hall. It was in the daily choices made by people who decided, one by one, that they would not accept the world as it was but would fight for the world as it should be. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Maybe that was everything. The seasons changed slowly, and with them, so did the city. The once sluggish reforms gained momentum, fueled not by fear but by a growing sense of collective ownership. Community patrol initiatives were created, cultural competency training became a staple in police academies, and the Oversight Board began publishing monthly transparency reports that held real weight. People stopped seeing justice as something abstract, something distant. It became real, tangible, something they could shape and influence. Alicia watched this evolution with a cautious optimism, knowing full well that progress was never a straight line but a path fraught with obstacles and setbacks. Yet despite the inevitable challenges, the changes held, stubborn and resilient, much like the people who had demanded them. For Reed and Miller, the aftermath of their actions settled into a bitter but fitting reality. Disgraced and stripped of their authority, they became cautionary tales whispered through the ranks of law enforcement across the state. Reed tried to rebuild his life, taking a job at a small private security firm that barely paid enough to cover his rent, the shadow of his past actions following him into every interview, every neighborhood he dared to live in. He grew quieter, more withdrawn, burdened not just by public shame but by an internal reckoning he could not escape. Miller, on the other hand, struggled harder. After failed attempts to find stable work, he turned to community service in earnest, not because he was forced but because, deep down, he needed to find a way to atone, to do something that mattered again. Over time, through humble, invisible acts of service, he began to piece together a different version of himself, one that no longer needed a badge to feel worthy. Officer Jenkins rose quietly within the newly formed Civilian Oversight Board, earning respect for his honesty, his willingness to listen, and his unwavering commitment to rebuilding trust between police and community. He became a bridge between two worlds that had long existed in parallel hostility, showing others that redemption was possible not through words but through action, through steady, stubborn decency. His journey was not celebrated with headlines or grand speeches, but in small victories, a protest avoided through dialogue, a youth intervention program expanded, a trust cautiously extended and carefully kept. As for Alicia, her life transformed in ways she had never anticipated. She continued her work as a judge but now took on an even greater role as an advisor, a mentor, a catalyst for systemic change beyond the courtroom. Universities invited her to speak not just about law but about leadership, resilience, and the quiet, necessary revolutions born from refusal to accept the unacceptable. She published a book, a raw and unflinching account of her journey, not to seek fame but to leave behind a roadmap for others who would inevitably walk similar paths. She found herself standing in front of audiences that stretched from local classrooms to national stages, telling her story not as a tale of personal triumph, but as a collective call to action. Yet even amidst accolades and recognition, Alicia never let herself forget the night it all began, the flashing lights, the cold cuffs, the humiliation. It lived in her bones, a scar she wore not with bitterness but with fierce pride. It reminded her of what was at stake, of why the fight could never be about her ego, her power, her image. It had to remain about the countless others whose names the world might never know, but whose lives mattered no less. One evening, standing on the rooftop of the courthouse under a bruised purple sky, Alicia reflected on the journey that had brought her here. Marcus stood beside her, silent as they watched the city lights flicker into existence, each one a fragile, stubborn declaration against the darkness. He handed her a folded piece of paper without speaking, and when she opened it, she found a handwritten note from one of her former students, now a public defender, thanking her for inspiring her to fight for those no one else would fight for. Alicia smiled, the kind of smile that comes not from momentary happiness but from the deep, abiding satisfaction of a life lived with purpose. She tucked the note into her pocket, feeling its weight settle against her heart. As they stood together, Marcus finally broke the silence. "You ever wonder what would have happened if you had stayed quiet that night?" Alicia thought about it, the easy path, the safe path, and shook her head. "No," she said firmly. "Because silence would have been another kind of death." And with that, they turned away from the edge, stepping back into the life they had chosen, complicated, imperfect, but undeniably their own. And so Alicia Carter's story became more than a headline, more than a court case, more than even a movement. It became a legacy, one built not from anger alone but from courage, from resilience, from the stubborn, unyielding belief that justice, though battered and bruised, could still stand, could still grow, could still win. And now, I want to ask you, the one who walked every step of this journey with us today, How many times in your own life have you been faced with the choice to stay silent or to stand up? How many times have you wondered if your voice could actually make a difference? Alicia's story reminds us that real change does not begin with grand gestures or sweeping revolutions. It begins with one decision. One act of courage. One refusal to accept injustice as the final word. So I leave you with this question: when the moment comes for you, and it will come, will you have the courage to speak, to act, to become the change that someone else desperately needs? Think about it. Reflect on it. And if this story moved you, if it sparked something deep inside you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us your story. Tell us your dreams for a better world. And of course, if you want to hear more powerful, emotional, and inspiring stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist. Join our community, where every story is a spark, and every voice matters. Thank you for being here. See you in the next story.